Chapter 8. The Slow Recovery. 1945 to 1953. Destiny, the rock against which everything breaks into pieces, had arrived. On May the 8th, 1945, the armistice at Reims put an end to the war. A week before, Hitler had committed suicide in the bunker of the Reichstag. From a few days before, in the Piazza Loreto in Milan, the body of Benito Mussolini dangled head down. An anguished, starving population wandered across the smoldering graveyard of Europe. This was worsened by the revision of the borders, the movement of peoples, discrimination, and resentment. After the war, it was impossible to prevent the Cold War from starting. In March 1946, Churchill said, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain dividing Europe has fallen." Europe sought refuge in unity. The European movements which arose in 1945 in Brussels took shape in 1949 in the Council of Europe. The Marshall Plan laid the economic basis for recuperation, and in Paris an organism for cooperation, the OECD, was set up, and in Eastern Europe the Comecon was established. From 1945 to 1950, the United States imposed a government presided by General MacArthur on Japan, together with a new constitution, while its war criminals were being tried, reparations were being decided, and reconstruction got underway. In 1949, the government of Yoshida signed a far-reaching alliance with the United States, which returned its independence in 1951. The Treaty of San Francisco took away all the territories conquered by Japan. In November 1945, the war criminals were being tried in Nuremberg. Hermann Göring committed suicide before he had heard his sentence. Martin Bormann fled, and the others listened undaunted to the narration of their feats. On October 1st, 1946, 11 Nazi leaders were sentenced to hang. Many others were shot. In the USSR, victory consolidated the tyranny of Stalin. In 1946, a new constitution was drafted and the government was reorganized. Bulganin, the Minister of Defense since 1947 and Secretary of the Central Committee, controlled the army and the party. 2 years later, with the death of Zandov, Malenkov, Beria, and Khrushchev made their appearance on the scene. Priority was given to heavy industry, again more guns and less butter. The fourth five-year plan gave a boost to the construction of houses, roads, and railways. Rearmament was encouraged, and the exploitation of Siberia began. Stalin's foreign policy was successful. Until 1945, only the USSR was considered as a socialist country. But after the war, many Eastern countries fell under its influence, thus altering the balance of power and affecting international politics. In 1949, the Comecon divided the world economy. Shortly afterwards, the Warsaw Pact divided the world into two blocs which eyed each other with suspicion. The Cold War was now a fact. The Socialist Bloc devoured entire regions. In 1945, Stalin annexed Polish territory, a part of Prussia, and a part of the Ukrainian Carpathians. In 1947, he annexed Finnish Karelia and Romanian Bessarabia, which had been agreed under the 1947 Paris Peace Treaty. The USSR encouraged instability in the countries within its orbit. Czechoslovakia, whose government in exile had compromised itself with Stalin, agreed to form a government with Masaryk and Edward Beneš. Communist pressure was such that Masaryk committed suicide in 1948 and Beneš left the government. The country fell into the Soviet orbit. In Poland, after the setting up of a government of national unity, there were differences between the communists of Władysław Gomulka and the nationalists of Bolesław Bierut. In the 1947 elections, the Democratic Bloc had 80% of the votes. A year later, Gomulka fell as he had criticized the collectivization of agriculture and opposed condemning Tito. In 1949, the friction between church and state began to look impossible to overcome. The monarchy was bloodily abolished in 1946 in Bulgaria. The rural workers were sacrificed by the pro-Soviet government of Georgy Dimitrov. In 1944, the government in exile had returned to Athens, and a year later King George II returned to be succeeded in 1947 by his brother Paul. The communists proclaimed the Republic in the north and provoked a civil war. The government of Alexander Papagos had the task of reconstructing the nation. Turkey opted for the West after the victory of the Democratic Party. In May 1946, President Truman authorized $400 million in aid for Turkey and Greece. The will to prevent new wars resulted in the San Francisco Conference on June 26, 1945, and this led to the setting up of the United Nations. The United Nations had some successes. In 1946, Soviet and British troops left Iran, and the Shah Reza Pahlavi, despite an attempt on his life in 1949, reunified the country in spite of Soviet intriguing to encourage nationalism in Azerbaijan and Kurdistan. In 1945 in Cairo, the Arab League was set up in order to coordinate the foreign policy of the Islamic world. A new factor arose in the zone: the Jews who demanded their historic rights over the Holy Land, Israel. The United Nations voted on November 29, 1947 for an end to the British mandate in Palestine and the division of the territory in two, Israel and an Arab-Palestinian country. The Arabs disagreed with the decision and attacked the Jews the next day. On May 14, 1948, the National Jewish Council proclaimed independence with David Ben-Gurion as Prime Minister and Chaim Weizmann as President. The United States and the USSR recognized Israeli independence. Abdul Allah of Jordan besieged Jerusalem, and 80,000 Jews prepared to defend themselves. The Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, and Iraq joined together against Israel. The Jews occupied Ramleh and Lod, seized Nazareth and Upper Galilee. In the first few months of 1949, they occupied the Negev as far as the frontier with Egypt, except for the Gaza coastal strip. It was an intermittent war, 60 days of fighting and 20 months of problems. In May 1949, Israel was admitted to the United Nations. In April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty had been signed in Washington, and a year later Germany adhered to this treaty. The alliance was made at the height of the Cold War, when communism triumphed in Czechoslovakia and Berlin was blockaded. In view of the post-war state of Europe in 1947, Truman had entrusted his Secretary of State, George Marshall, with an aid plan consisting of soft credits or with no hope of recovering the money, and the dispatch of raw materials and food. It was vital to save Europe from falling into the power of the communists, who were already firmly installed in Italy and France. Truman knew that victory meant making the defeated win too. The panorama in Italy was gloomy. Fascism was purged, those who had been repatriated were looked after, and the country was rebuilt where it occasionally came near to civil war. Victor Emmanuel III abdicated in favor of his son Umberto I and went into exile. Alcide de Gasperi, the first secretary of the Christian Democrats, proclaimed the Republic in 1946. Everything went off with normality. Enrico de Nicola became president, and the constitution was approved. Italy began to reconstruct with aid from the United States, but it lost Istria, which became part of Yugoslavia. It also lost its imperial colonies, Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia. It had to pay war reparations, another difficulty added to those arising from political differences between the socialists of Neni and the communists of Togliatti. The Christian Democrat Luigi Einaudi put into practice European policies and was able to surmount the agrarian crisis in the south by expropriating the owners of large estates in Calabria. In France, de Gaulle began the hunt for collaborationists and the leaders of the Vichy government. Pétain was sentenced to death, which was later commuted to life imprisonment, and Pierre Laval was executed. In October 1945, there were elections for the National Assembly, and these were won by the left. The Bank of France was nationalized, as well as insurance and the coal industry. De Gaulle gave power to Georges Bidault, who opposed the decolonization of Algeria. In 1946, the Fourth Republic was set up, and the following year the socialists Vicente Auriol and Paul Ramadier controlled the destiny of the country. However, discontent and strikes were creating problems. Paris was paralyzed. The communist Maurice Thorez opposed military loans for Indochina and the blocking of salaries, and went on to provoke disturbances which led to an economic crisis and a rise in prices. France was saved from disaster by the devaluation of the franc, United States aid, and the economic policy of Robert Schuman, among other factors. Britain ended the war $14,000 million in debt. German bombing had destroyed whole districts of London, Liverpool, and Manchester. The country was undercapitalized and the pound halved in value. The joy at the return of the royal family was not enough to calm the social unrest, which took the Labour Party to power. Clement Attlee took over from Winston Churchill, but his policy was the same: collaboration with the United States and a distancing of Britain from Europe. The austerity imposed by the minister Stafford Cripps sped up recuperation. Imports had to be restricted, rationing was resorted to, and the debt had to be paid. In 1945, the Bank of England and the coal industry, transport, energy, and the steel industry were nationalized. The obligatory nature of national insurance, healthcare, family allowances, and the rise in pensions was stressed in order to assuage the low salaries. In November 1947, Princess Elizabeth, King George IV's firstborn, married Prince Philip of Greece. The grand ceremony was held in Westminster Abbey and officiated by the Archbishops of Canterbury and York. Bevin, the Foreign Secretary, transformed the Commonwealth into an association of independent states. A government of transition was set up in India, leading to independence in 1947 amid confrontations between Hindus and Muslims. Gandhi was assassinated in New Delhi, victim of the climate of violence. In Ireland, the Irish Republic was proclaimed in 1949. When Churchill regained power in 1951, Britain had still not resigned itself to the loss of the empire. British troops occupied Suez when Egypt refused to continue with the treaty imposed by the British. Times had changed. That same year, King Farouk of Egypt abdicated in favor of his 7-month-old son Fuad and appointed a government presided over by General Naguib. A year later, the Republic was proclaimed. Germany also emerged from the war ruined. The mark was worthless, and, among other things, American cigarettes were used as a means of exchange. Everything from coal to meat was rationed until the beginning of the 50s. At the conferences of Tehran and Yalta, the Allies had not reached definitive agreements. In June 1945, it was stipulated that the military commands of the 4 zones in which the country was divided would assume governmental powers. A month later, Truman, Churchill, and Stalin met at Potsdam. At this meeting, there emerged the new map of Europe and the splitting up of Germany. Russia kept Eastern Prussia, and Poland took the territory east of the Oder-Neisse line. Berlin was given a special statute. The Germans who had settled in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland would return to Germany. The administration of the country was put under the control of the Allies. Consortiums, trusts, and trade unions were dissolved, industry was dismantled, and war reparations agreed to. These included the following measures: an embargo on the merchant navy, patents, capital deposited in foreign banks, the mines, the Krupp and Farben industrial complexes, and technology. In the eastern sector, 25% of the factories became Soviet property. This amounted to 200 companies. The National Socialist Party was forbidden and its leaders imprisoned, while 6 million possible Nazis were interrogated. Political parties were authorized again. In 1948, the Conference of London recommended the economic integration of Germany with a new constitution and international control of the Ruhr. Stalin responded by blockading and dividing Berlin, but the dice had been thrown. In 1949, West Germany became a federal republic with Konrad Adenauer, president of the CDU, as chancellor. The Russians created the German Democratic Republic. Partition was consummated. In 1950, Leopold III of Belgium abdicated in favor of his son Baldwin, who was not to occupy the throne until he became of age. In the East, the process of decolonization began. Europe could no longer remain in Africa, Asia, or Oceania. New independent countries were created. Parallel 38 split Korea in two. The North was organized under a popular front, and in the South, there was a pro-American military government. After the elections to the National Assembly in August 1948, South Korea was set up with Syngman Rhee as president. In the North, the Popular Republic of North Korea was proclaimed, with Kim Sung as prime minister. Foreign troops withdrew and left behind an explosive frontier. The North violated the 38th parallel in June 1950, and Seoul lay at its mercy. The United States requested a meeting of the Security Council, which sent in troops. MacArthur landed at Incheon. The Chinese army joined in and prolonged the war until the summer of 1953, leaving behind 1 million dead. This number would have been higher had President Truman not firmly rejected the suggestion by MacArthur to drop the atom bomb on China. 3 months before, in March 1953, Stalin died. Although his role in foreign policy since 1945 had been enigmatic, it left behind the Chinese Revolution and the totalitarian regimes in Eastern Europe. Generally speaking, his planned economy was beneficial for Russia. He inherited a country which plowed the earth with wooden plows, and he supplied it with nuclear reactors. It was a pity that his work was built on tyranny. In Indochina, where the Japanese had wrested control from France in 1945, the Potsdam Conference envisaged 2 zones of influence on either side of Parallel 16. In the north, Ho Chi Minh created the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and in the south, Britain re-established French domination in 1946. Cambodia became independent. France, which was attempting to return to the earlier ultra-nationalistic situation, provoked the First Indo-Chinese War. The Foreign Legion occupied the Mekong Delta but underestimated the offensive capacity of the Viet Minh, which, under the command of General Giap, inflicted so many defeats that the pro-French government of the ex-emperor Bao Dai was forced to ask for help. The United States helped France, and the conflict became entangled. The USSR and China offered help to Ho Chi Minh. China was undergoing a period of instability. Chiang Kai-shek occupied the large cities but was incapable of imposing order and set himself up as a dictator with the approval of the United States. In 1945, the USSR signed a pact with Mao, and the confrontation of the Nationalist Army of the Kuomintang and the Communists led to civil war. In 1949, Mao took Nanking and proclaimed the Popular Republic. A year later, after successes in Hainan, Mao intervened in Korea and Indochina. In the United States, Harry Truman based his policy on anti-communism. In 1947, Senator Joseph McCarthy set up an inquisitorial mechanism, the Commission on Anti-American Activities. The nuclear monopoly and the capacity for maneuvering in the United Nations gave Truman a leadership in the world, which he used to shape policy to his vision of things. He was convinced that Stalin proposed to dominate Europe, and to prevent this, he increased economic aid for the free countries. This was the Truman Doctrine, which was criticized by the liberal sectors in his country, but it remained dominant throughout the Cold War and influenced relations with the USSR. In May of that year, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, was set up. It depended on the Council for National Security, set up a few months earlier in order to coordinate the secret services. Truman won a second mandate in 1948 and announced his program of social compromise in the line laid down by Roosevelt, the New Deal. He knew that social unrest was not only abroad. In March 1949, 500,000 miners went on strike in the United States. This was a sign of what was happening in the country, and Roosevelt proposed to govern bearing the real situation in mind. Despite congressional opposition, he earmarked public funds for education, the electrification of rural areas, and the construction of houses. The United States government was obsessed with espionage. The physicist Julius Rosenberg and his wife Ethel were accused of selling atomic secrets to the Soviet Council. They were condemned to death on the electric chair. This was a symptom of the growing intensity of the Cold War between the two powers. In foreign policy, the Berlin airlift to break the Soviet blockade took up part of Truman's energies in June 1948. Truman organized air corridors and 2.5 million tons of goods were transported by air. Stalin put an end to the incident. The Republican Dwight Eisenhower won the 1952 elections. His triumph prevented the United States becoming implicated in the Indo-Chinese War at the time. The American hemisphere tended towards normality in some countries and towards dictatorships in others. In Mexico, the PRI presented its first candidate for the presidency, Miguel Alemán, who professionalized politics and got rid of the revolutionary chiefs. Alemán modernized the structures of the country and developed plans for industrialization and improved agriculture. At this time, Colombia was going through its most dramatic period. An unknown assassin shot at Jorge Eliezer Gaitán, leader of the Liberal Party, and considered as the victor in the next elections. The assassin was lynched and killed by the crowd, and this began the tragic confrontations known as El Bogotazo. President Ospina decreed martial law, and his guards opened fire on the crowds. In only 16 hours, over 300 people were killed. In Argentina, political and social life began to center on two characters: Juan Domingo Perón, imprisoned in October 1945, and El Duarte, who filled the streets of Buenos Aires with descamisados, the shirtless, in order to demand the return of Perón. In 1952, Evita died, a victim of leukemia. More than 70,000 people filed past her corpse, laid out wearing a white evening dress in the Labor Ministry. Life continued to impose its customs. Everyone knew that an era was passing and another was beginning. Despite McCarthyism and Puritanism, liberalization was in the air. Coinciding with the atomic tests on the Bikini Atoll, a novel swimming costume was launched in Paris, and it was to be all the rage on the beaches together with sunglasses and sun lotion. The general public was taken with the phenomenon which is becoming universal: flying saucers, after the police in the state of Maryland reported a strange circular object in the sky. From 1948 on, housewives would have more time to spare. Maxon invented the takeaway, the famous TV dinners, the Kenwood Chef kitchen robot, which kneaded, ground, mixed, cut, squeezed, spun, and even opened tins. It was the Great Kitchen Revolution, which also saw Percy Spender's microwave and the radar range of the Raytheon Company. In 1948, Columbia Records launched the long play, which had been invented by a CBS team directed by Peter Goldmark. The microgroove and the radio would change the style of life after the invention of the transistor by Bell Telephone in 1948. On July 7, 1950, television began to be broadcast in color. After the war, the cinema began to pick up, but the number of cinemas in the United States dropped from 30,000 to 14,000. The USSR had 21,000 and Italy 8,000. Television was to blame. In 1945, there were 30,000 receivers in the United States. 5 years later, there were 15 million. Attendance at cinemas fell by 40%, but a large number of films continued to be produced. In 1945, Fritz Lang made Perversion with Edward G. Robinson, Joan Bennett, and Margaret Lindsay. Bob Hope produced and acted in Dark and Dangerous together with Dorothy Lamour and Peter Lorre. In 1950, José Ferrer won the Best Actor award for his portrayal of Cyrano de Bergerac. Francis Albert Sinatra separated from his wife Nancy and married the Hollywood goddess Ava Gardner in 1951. William Holden starred in the film of Thornton Wilder's novel Symphony of Life under the direction of Sam Wood. Elia Kazan created the Actors Studio in New York, where Marlon Brando and Paul Newman were formed with the Stanislavski method. 25% of films were westerns. John Ford had disciples such as King Vidor with Duel in the Sun and Tulsa, in which Stuart Heisley reflects the birth of an oil empire with Susan Hayward and Robert Preston. Sport was represented by the London Olympics in 1948 with the feats of the Dane Fanny Blankers-Koen and her 4 gold medals, and the triumph of a very special runner, the Czech Satopek. In 1948, the International Motorcycle Federation was founded. Formula One racing also began. In science, 1946 was the year of the atomic tests in the Pacific, the pistol shot starting off the nuclear race. The German engineer Konrad Zuse had perfected his Z3, the first automated digital calculating machine, the first computer capable of receiving a registered program. It used thousands of valves and relays. Analyzers were designed everywhere. The computer age had begun. However, not everything was being made for peaceful purposes. In 1950, Truman approved the hydrogen bomb. 3 years later, the Russians also had this lethal weapon. The Western powers investigated the German V-2s, and the United States sent the Blossom, the Bumpers, and the Vikings into space. The first American probe, the Viking, reached a height of 80 kilometers. The scientist John Franklin Enders began the fight against polio. The force of Picasso's Guernica, painted in 1937 during his Expressionist period, had left an impact on everyone. The artist was now considered to be one of the greatest geniuses of the 20th century. He settled down in Vallauris, where he worked intensively on ceramics. Time passed slowly, healing the wounds of war. People sought to forget and tried hard to imagine a better future. A different future in harmony with the new times. The future had to be built by all. The people rebelled against oppression. In mid-1953, the world shuddered on seeing how the demonstrators took over the offices of the Communist Party in East Berlin, demanding free elections. The Soviet army unleashed its tanks and executed the leaders. It seemed as if the world would never find peace.